afternoon, everyone. The subcommittee will come to order. Before we begin, I would like to ask unanimous consent that our colleagues, Chairman Miller, Mr. Gus Bilirakis, and Mr. David Reichert be allowed to sit at the dais, make opening statements, and ask questions. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I want to thank all of you for joining us here today to discuss legislation pending before the subcommittee concerning education benefits and employment programs for our returning service members and veterans. This afternoon we have 9 important pieces of legislation before us. I will focus my remarks on 2 of these bills, which I introduced earlier this year. The first is H.R. 4037, the Improving Veterans Access to Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment Act of 2014. This bill would streamline VA's vocational rehabilitation and employment, or known as the VR&E program. This program helps disabled veterans become employment ready and also assists the most severely disabled veterans reach a point of maximum independent daily living. As I've said multiple times, I believe this program is one of the greatest resources our VA has to help our veterans with disabilities overcome many challenges they encounter when trying to find employment. However, I believe improvements need to be made to ensure that our most disabled veterans do not get lost in the shuffle while enduring long wait times to see a counselor. My bill would authorize the Secretary to prioritize VR&E services based on need so that they are able to triage cases as they come in based upon the severity of the veteran's disability or on other factors as determined by the Secretary. It would also require that any education or training courses a veteran pursues through the VR&E be approved for GI Bill benefits and would allow for home adaptations that are currently being completed for VR&E participants to be completed under specially adapted housing rules to ensure that our veterans are receiving high-quality adaptations to their homes. The bill would also redefine eligibility for voc rehab for veterans with a 10% disability. This provision would further streamline this benefit and help severely disabled veterans get the benefits and services they are qualified to receive in an expedited fashion. My second bill is H.R. 4038, the Veterans Benefits Administration Information Technology Improvement Act of 2014. This bill would require the VA to improve and finish the IT systems that adjudicates and tracks GI Bill and VR&E claims. At this day and age, veterans shouldn't have to wait should have to endure long delays in receiving their earned education and VR&E benefits due to a lacking and/or outdated IT system. Through this legislation, VA would be able to adjudicate to the maximum extent possible all GI Bill claims in a paperless environment and would be able to accurately track services and outcomes provided by the VR&E program to veterans. Through multiple GAO reports and hearings during this Congress, the subcommittee has been shown the need to improve these systems. I know the ranking member also has a bill on this as well, and I look forward to working with him to combine our 2 pieces of legislation to ensure these IT programs are improved to better serve Americans' veterans. I believe that both of these bills are critical to VA's successes and will allow the VA to more efficiently and thoroughly assist our veterans as they work toward a successful life through their service. With that being said, I'm eager to discuss each of the 9 pieces of legislation before us today, and I am grateful to my colleagues who have introduced these bills and to our witnesses for being here to discuss them with us. I look forward to a productive and meaningful session. I also will now yield to my colleague, Ranking Member Takano, for any opening statement he may have.
Thank you, Chairman Flores. Good morning, or actually it's good afternoon. I would like to thank everyone for joining us and to thank the witnesses for taking time to testify and answer our questions. We do have a number of bills before us today which seek to reauthorize the VA Advisory Committee on Credentialing, prioritize VR&E services, help veterans obtain their licenses or credentialing through examination, require a longitudinal study, and create a survey for users of the GI Bill. I support my colleagues' bills that aim to improve the lives of our veterans, and of the 9 pieces of legislation, I have sponsored 2 bills which seek to help our veterans attending college. My first bill, H.R. 3056, the Warriors Peer Outreach Pilot Program Act, would direct the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to carry out a 3-year pilot program on the provision of outreach and support services to veterans pursuing higher education. I see this program as supplementing Vet Success on Campus, which uses credentialed and experienced vocational rehabilitation counselors to provide services to student veterans. The Warriors Peer Outreach Program will provide peer-to-peer services by employing veterans who have used the GI Bill. The VA will train veterans to assist individuals who may have a difficulty in adjusting or may need services or support that the institution is not equipped to provide. Again, this pilot program is designed to explore a new approach to on-campus services for veterans and to act as a supplement to other federal programs with similar goals. I believe that it has the potential to help many veterans across the country, and I hope all our stakeholders will support it. Today, we will also be discussing H.R. 4147, the Student Veterans IT Upgrade Act, which would require the VA to report on the current status of the long-term solution for education claims processing, provide an action plan to improve it, and outline the anticipated cost of upgrading the system. I find it unfortunate that the VA has not completed this system and want to know when and how they plan to do so. Complete automation would provide the VA a more powerful system that is more responsive to the needs of our veterans. I may add that I look forward to working with Chairman Miller, Chairman Flores, on combining our bills. I believe they're complementary with regard to the Student Veterans IT Upgrade Act. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for scheduling this hearing to review these bills. I look forward to the testimony and suggestions from our panelists. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Takano. Chairman Miller of the full committee will be joining us to discuss his bill, H.R. 4031, the Department of Veterans Affairs Management Accountability Act of 2014. We will yield to Chairman Miller when he arrives. In the meantime, it is an honor to be joined by my friends and colleagues to discuss their bills. Thank each of you for being here. Mr. Cook is not here yet. We will allow him to speak as soon as he gets here. Ms. Kirkpatrick is not here, but she submitted a statement for the record. Hearing no objection, we will enter hers into the record. Mr. Bilirakis, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and thanks for allowing me to sit in on the panel today. Again, I want to thank you for holding this legislative hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak on my bill, H.R. 4151, the GI Bill Survey Act. Members of the committee understand that many challenges our veterans have in transitioning into civilian life after service to our great nation. America has always been the land of opportunity, and it is our responsibility that our veterans are equipped with the necessary resources to pursue that happiness. The brave men and women in our military services have answered the call to protect the liberties we are entitled to. Likewise, we must answer the call for our veterans. I'm sure you'll agree. Through the GI Bill, veterans can utilize these benefits to cover tuition, housing, books and supplies, testing and certification fees, and other education-related expenditures. Since the enactment of the post-9/11 Veterans Educational Assistance Act of 2008, over 1 million of our nation's veterans have participated in this program. By fiscal year 2011, the post-9/11 GI Bill had the largest number of participants and highest total of obligations when compared to previous GI bills since 1984. The VA provided nearly $10 billion for that fiscal year in education benefits for veterans and beneficiaries, with the majority of these benefits applied to the post-9/11 GI Bill program. One of the biggest problems we continue to encounter when discussing the GI Bill is the lack of data available regarding to its participants. This goes beyond simply performance and outcome measures, but it also includes basic demographic information. In May of 2013, the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, conducted a study on the challenges with student veterans face pursuing higher education and the obstacles regarding VA's management on the program that also affects veterans' academic success. The GAO reported the following, and I quote, "It is unclear the extent to which veterans are achieving successful academic outcomes, and VA lacks a plan for using student outcomes data from its new data collection efforts to improve its education programs. And I quote again, current data on student veterans are outdated or incomplete. The GAO recommended the VA to create a plan to use new data on student outcomes to improve program management. The VA agreed with the recommendations and noted a number of actions it was taking to address these issues. Although that is progress, this committee has not received any information regarding their efforts or progress on this initiative. Without objection from the chairman, I would like to submit the summary of the GAO report for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. To safeguard this important resource and to ensure our nation's veterans that their success into civilian life is a top priority of ours, I have introduced H.R. 4151, the GI Bill Survey Act. This comprehensive study would encompass several elements to better understand the effectiveness of the Transition Assistance Program, known as TAP, and what improvements can be made to VA education benefits. The first step in making the positive changes to a program is to fully understand its benefits and drawbacks. H.R. 4151 would require the Secretary of VA to contract with a third-party entity to conduct a survey of GI Bill users. The survey would be a comprehensive study of veterans' experiences when using their education benefits. The survey would prove beneficial to both the VA and Congress by providing a better understanding of a veteran's experience from the processing in the VA to their experiences with the school certifying official and how their education benefits and this program have benefited them. I appreciate the support for H.R. 4151 by the American Legion, the VFW, and the Students Veterans of America who came to testify before this committee, as well as the support of the Association of Private Sector Colleges, Wounded Warrior Program, and then also the Vets First. They all submitted their testimonies for the record. I encourage my colleagues on this committee to support this bipartisan piece of legislation. I hope we can come together to keep our promise to our veterans and ensure that the men and women who dedicated their lives to serving our nation have the viable resources to successfully transition into civilian life. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Bilirakis. Mr. Reichert, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Takano, and other members of the subcommittee. Thanks for having me here today at this legislative hearing, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about the Military Skills for Careers Act, which is H.R. 3614. I introduced this legislation to help our veterans transition their military skills and expertise into long-term civilian jobs. And it sounds like from listening to the description of other bills, these all are really going to fold nicely and neatly together, and that's, hey, it's happening here in Congress, so that's shocking, right? Also, there's Senate support for this bill, so that's exciting too. The Senate and the House of Representatives actually working together. I understand veterans issues brings people together, and that's a good thing. Some examples of the jobs included in this act, some of the skills that some of our military folks will learn that are compatible with this act are inclusive of electricians, truck drivers, healthcare professionals, IT workers. I have a nephew who just got out of the Marines, and he is soon be getting out of the Marines. He's a diesel mechanic. So those professions, all taught, all performed within the military, are really applied to our public life, and we've got to make it easier for our veterans to transition into those jobs. So by making licensings and credentials in those chosen fields more accessible, we can do this. This legislation would open opportunities to those veterans struggling to find employment. Additionally, I want to mention that Senator Richard Burr, as I kind of alluded to, ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, has been an outstanding partner in this effort, and I'm pleased to have his leadership on this legislation in the Senate. When our veterans return from active service, the last thing they should have to fear is unemployment. After all, they sacrifice to keep us safe. We have responsibility to ensure their security when they return, and a big part of that is being able to find a job and provide for themselves and their families. I'm sure you all know families that are wondering, what are we going to do? What's my family going to do? How are we going to feed our kids? Where are we going to live? How are we going to pay for this? Those are worries we need to remove. We have to remove those. It's up to us to be their champions. According to figures released last week by the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, the unemployment rate for veterans who served on active duty since 9/11 was 9% in 2013. Although this represented a decline from 2012, newly separated veterans are still entering the toughest civilian labor market in a generation. In my own state of Washington, we have 675,000 veterans, Mr. Chairman, and the largest military base on the West Coast. Some people don't realize that, right in Washington State, the largest military base on the West Coast in the Seattle-Tacoma area. And over the next few years, the Joint Base Lewis McChord is set to discharge 6,000 troops per year. 6,000 per year just out of one base looking for work. I want those troops to know that we have a bright future waiting for them, that we're working for them and they don't have to worry. All too often, recently separated veterans are facing hurdles transitioning their military skills to civilian employment or identifying occupations in which they are interested that lead to long-term employment and security. As our service members and their families reintegrate back into communities, we have the opportunity and the duty to guarantee the success of our greatest generation. As a part of this most important mission, I introduced the Military Skills Act as a step to ensuring we're helping to secure bright futures for our men and women. I often hear from members of the business community in Washington State seeking highly qualified candidates with expertise compatible with skills gained in the military. Our challenge in Congress is to find ways to help veterans seeking employment. One way that this can be done is through reforms to the state license and certification process for veterans. Generally, private sector businesses are looking for specific licenses and certifications to determine the most qualified candidate to fill a job position. Even though a veteran may have the qualifications and skills necessary for the job, they are too often turned away because they lack the documentation. To address this, many states, including Washington, have led through example by passing laws allowing veterans to obtain licenses or certifications in their training from the military so that they meet state standards. This helps streamline the application process, eliminates the need for veterans to go through redundant, sometimes costly training. In turn, businesses are able to hire veterans who have the necessary credentials to proficiently get the job done. This legislation, Mr. Chairman, simply all it does is say let the veterans take a test. If they pass the test, they get a job. I should have just said that and said I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Reichert. Mr. Cook, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Our committee's more disciplined than our visitors on our minutes now.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. H.R. 4150, the Veterans Employment and Training Service Longitudinal Study Act, there's a mouthful, ensures that veterans are receiving effective and successful employment training services. This bipartisan bill authorizes an independent organization to collect, analyze data on the effectiveness of the Department of Labor's Veterans Employment Training Service. The study will focus on veterans who have received intensive services from two programs under veterans, that acronym I just referred to, the Disabled Veterans Outreach Program and the Local Veterans Employment Representatives, LVER. The study will track the employment status of veterans who receive these services, determine if the program contributed to their employment, monitor the employment retention rate and determine if the services provided help them increase their average earnings. A report on the findings will be presented to the Committee on Veterans Affairs in the House and Senate every year for the next 5 years. Congress has a duty to provide our veterans with the best employment services possible. Simply authorizing these programs isn't enough. We have to follow up and ensure they are working as intended. An analysis of long-term outcomes is precisely the type of oversight Congress needs to determine the effectiveness of these programs and to ensure their success. I think today you're hearing a lot of similar programs, as my distinguished colleague had mentioned earlier. It's all about follow-up. If it isn't working, we got to change. The bottom line is the success rate should be much higher. I'm a veteran. I'm very, very passionate about people that have served. That's one of the things that we have as an ingredient of military service. When you go out on a patrol in a combat situation, you want to follow up that everybody's got enough water, that you have protection, that you have the codes, the radio frequencies, if you called in a prepositioned bombardment mortars, what have you, that you have it. That is your job. And with such a poor record in getting these people into the right position, I think it's incumbent upon us, in keeping with the philosophy of taking care of our troops, that we find out how we can make it better. If we've got to make changes, and the appropriate funding hopefully will follow that outlook. I want to thank Congresswoman Titus for the support on this important bill. And once again, the follow-up and the feedback when we get on this can hopefully help us achieve better results and take care of our men and women. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. And again, as a reminder to everyone, when Chairman Miller arrives, we will allow him to speak to support his legislation. I now want to recognize our first panel of witnesses today. Joining us is Mr. Kurt Coy, the Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Opportunity at the Department of Veterans Affairs. We also have with us the Honorable Keith Kelly, Assistant Secretary of the Veterans Employment and Training Service at the Department of Labor, who is accompanied by Ms. Demetra Nightingale. If I messed that name up, I'm sorry. The Chief Evaluation Officer of the Department of Labor. Thank all of you for being with us today and for your service during your time on active duty with our armed forces. Before I recognize Mr. Coy, I'd like to point out again the Department of Labor was again late with this testimony. We'd ask you to exercise appropriate diligence in providing that on time in the future. So, Mr. Coy, let's begin with you. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Takano, who just left. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to provide VA's views on 7 pending legislative bills affecting VA's programs. Other bills under discussion today would affect programs or laws administered by the Department of Labor, and respectfully, we defer to DOL on those bills. We are encouraged seeing so many legislative proposals aimed at improving the education and vocational rehabilitation program for our nation's veterans. VA supports H.R. 2942 that reestablishes the VA's Professional Certification and Licensure Advisory Committee. This legislation would allow VA to receive recommendations and receive advice from the committee with regard to licensing and certification programs. While VA appreciates the intent of 3056, which would establish a 3-year pilot program to provide outreach services to veterans using the post 9/11 GI Bill, VA does not believe this legislation is necessary, as it would create a program similar to our existing Vet Success on Campus program. H.R. 4031, the Department of Veterans Affairs Management Accountability Act of 2014, would enable the Secretary of Veterans Affairs to remove any individual from the senior executive service if the Secretary determines the performance of the individual warrants such removal. VA is committed to continuing our dialogue with the committee about effective accountability throughout VA but believe the Secretary has the tools under current law and regulations to address performance. VA appreciates the committee's focus to improve aspects of the vocational rehabilitation and employment program through H.R. 4037. VA is unable to support the provisions of the bill, but agrees with the intent to redefine the employment rehabilitation rate and note our own internal efforts to improve our performance measure calculations. We're also working to establish whether policy is needed to further restrict the approval of courses approved for Chapter 30 or 33. We would request clarification on Section 4 of this bill, which would expand eligibility for specially adapted housing grants to Chapter 31 veterans, but agree that modifications to adapt veterans' homes are best managed by SAH personnel with expertise and experience. While we're unable to support Section 6, which redefines serious employment handicap, we are happy to work with the committee on drafting technical language to ensure qualified veterans receive necessary services. VA is unable to support H.R. 4038, which makes IT improvements to reduce redundancy and process education and vocational rehabilitation and employment claims more efficiently. VA recognizes the committee's efforts to improve our IT processes, but notes that with competing resources affecting all veterans that served at VA, we need the flexibility to prioritize resources based on the needs of the entire department. VA requests clarification on the system, quote-unquote, being referenced in H.R. 4147, which requires the Chief Information Officer and the Deputy Undersecretary for Economic Opportunity to develop annual report detailing VA's plan for the system used to administer VA educational benefits. We'd be happy to provide information to the committee on the areas of interest once clarified. Finally, VA supports the intent behind H.R. 4151, which would require VA to administer a survey to individuals who have used VA education benefits. We are currently administering a similar survey with the assistance of a private contractor and will investigate the feasibility of combining the requirements of H.R. 4151 with VA's current resources. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my oral statement. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I would certainly be pleased to respond to any questions you or the other members of the subcommittee may have regarding our views as presented today.
Thank you, Mr. Coy. Chairman Miller, we have reserved 5 minutes for you, for your bill, or such time as you may need.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that I can revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much, and thank you for letting me speak out of order. And I'm not going to use my entire time nor use the entire statement that I have prepared, but I want to emphasize that 4031 in no way is meant to disparage the SES employees that are out there, the hardworking employees. It's really meant to help them. Every day, well over 300,000 employees at the VA go to work to do the right thing, and I think most of the members here would agree with that. But more than a dozen examples of a very shocking trend have actually now arisen, and we have listed them on our House website at veterans.house.gov/accountability. In fact, if you look at the recent VA preventable deaths that have been linked to mismanagement in Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Columbia, South Carolina, Augusta, Georgia, and Memphis, Tennessee, the VA executives who presided over the negligence are more likely to have received a bonus or glowing performance review than any type of punishment. And I think it's past time to end this complacency. Now, some have said that this bill would erode employee rights. To them I ask, why should government executives who are paid extremely well to serve the veterans of this country have the right to fail in their jobs with little threat of serious punishment? Not a single member of Congress would allow their staff to do the same. And those seeking VA health care, shouldn't they have the right to know that VA executives who preside over mismanagement and negligence will be punished swiftly and accordingly? There are those who say VA already has the necessary tools to properly discipline and fire failing executives. And I ask, if that's the case, why haven't we seen evidence in support of that particular argument? The reality is, to those who closely follow that we see something very differently. And in instance after instance where mismanagement has led to veterans suffering, department officials have repeatedly pointing to non-disciplinary actions such as employee retirements and transfers or bureaucratic slaps on the wrist, such as a temporary written warning in a disingenuous attempt to create the experience of accountability. It's common knowledge within VA and throughout the government that it's easier to transfer a failing executive or leave them unchecked than it is to fire them. And I don't think that's what the citizens of this country want to do. So I would ask all members to consider the primary mission of our committee. We are here to support veterans, and everything else should take second place. Mr. Chairman, thanks for your time. I yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Miller. Mr. Kelly, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Flores, Ranking Member Takano, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. As most of you know, my name is Keith Kelly, and I'm the Assistant Secretary for Veterans Employment and Training at the Department of Labor. Today, I'm accompanied by the Department's Chief Evaluation Officer, Demetra Nightingale. I will use my time here to highlight some of the Department's views on DOL-related legislation. The first bill I'd like to discuss is H.R. 3614, as we've already heard from one of your colleagues, the Military Skills to Careers Act. This bill would require each state to administer an exam and issue a credential or license to a veteran without requiring any training, should that veteran meet the certain criteria. H.R. 3614 would require the state to establish this program as a condition of receiving funding to employ disabled veteran outreach program specialists and local veteran employment representatives, more commonly referred to as DVOPs and leavers. The Department supports the intent of the legislation. However, we do have serious concerns about withholding DOL funding from states if they do not comply, because it is those very DVOPs and leavers that provide the critical intensive employment service to veterans, the transitioning service members, and their families. This legislation would jeopardize these services and penalize the very people this bill is aimed at helping. What's more, DOL is concerned that the administrative burdens on the states in complying with this legislation will be very significant. The reality is, in some states have hundreds of different credentials and licenses that are issued by dozens of different state agencies, and this bill would apply to them all. In fact, the majority of states have already adopted legislation aimed at streamlining credentialing and licensing for veterans. There are a variety of legislative and regulatory approaches that have proven successful in different states, and DOL is already working with the Department of Defense and the states to assist them in these efforts. For instance, we are working on a pilot program to analyze and compare transferable skills. In addition, the Department is providing technical support to certain states to award credit for military training and experience. Now to the second piece of the legislation that we also have heard from one of your colleagues, I'd like to discuss H.R. 4150, the Veterans Employment and Training Service Longitudinal Study Act. H.R. 4150 would give the Secretary of Labor access to the National Directory of New Hires information. At this time, DOL does not have authority to readily access these earnings data from state unemployment agencies, and as a result of that, we strongly support this provision. Without such authority, the process of obtaining earnings data is timely, costly, and burdensome. Moreover, the bill directs the Secretary to conduct a study of veterans and the long-term impact of DOL services. We estimate the cost to successfully complete this longitudinal study will be about $10 million over 5 years. Ultimately, the Department welcomes the opportunity to better understand the current impact of the services we provide for veterans so that we may continue to further enhance our programs and therefore improving a veterans' quality of life. We are ready to ensure that the legislation and the resulting study are well crafted. Thus, we do look forward to working with the committee on clarifying the goals and objectives of that survey. The Department of Labor sincerely appreciates the support of the committee, and we strive to provide higher quality, better targeted services to our nation's veterans. Chairman Flores, Ranking Committee Member Takano, and members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I'd be pleased to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Coy, let's begin with you. You heard Chairman Miller's opening comments a few minutes ago. Would you agree that there have been an alarming number of instances where the VA's SES employees have acted improperly?
As a 14-year senior executive in the government, that I've heard of some of those stories, but I'm not familiar with the individual ones. So it'd be irresponsible for me to comment on any one of those individual. Most of those were, from what I understand, on the VHA side of VA.
Can you tell us if any of VA's SES employees have been fired or disciplined over the past year because of problems like this? These problems are problems like this.
What I do know, Mr. Chairman, is that the Secretary has, to use your term, fired or removed 6 SESs in the past 2 years. 3 of them were senior executives in their first year of probation, and 3 were senior executives that were career senior executives outside of the probationary 1-year period.
Okay, we've heard that mentioned in earlier hearings. Can you actually, during a February 26th subcommittee on health hearing, Dr. Benishek was asked Undersecretary for Health, Dr. Petzel, to provide a list of everything VA has done to hold employees accountable in response to the preventable veteran deaths in Pittsburgh, Augusta, Columbia, Memphis, and Atlanta. And Dr. Petzel at that hearing, I saw this myself, said that he would provide that by the end of the week. It's been almost a month since that information was requested. So can you tell me when the VA will provide that information to Dr. Benishek's health subcommittee?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not familiar with specifics on what's holding up that information, but I will most certainly take that for the record and take that on.
Okay, we would appreciate that. There are also reports that the IG has laid out for us that there's evidence that the VA was complicit in multiple preventable deaths in those same locations. And that managers in those locations still receive bonuses. Can you tell us how that situation would occur?
Again, Mr. Chairman, I'm not familiar with those very specific cases. I will take that for the record and ensure that you get a response back.
Okay. Thank you. It's also one of the things that the subcommittee noted is that and I think this is one of the things that frustrates Chairman Miller. I'm not putting words in his mouth, but it frustrates him, it frustrates me, and that is that all but one of the VA's SES employees in fiscal 12 received high performance ratings. And it just seems like, here we are, we've had these preventable deaths, we've got a backlog that while it's coming down is still unacceptably high. And only one person gets something less than a high rating. That just doesn't seem like the way the real world would treat these types of issues. So do you find that a little strange that all but one SES employee wound up with a superior rating?
Well, Mr. Chairman, as I stated earlier, I've been a senior executive for 14 years. So I've hired and managed many senior executives. Before that, I spent about 7 years as a managing associate at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I was on the annual board of evaluation, and for 24 years before that as a naval officer. I would suggest that while I'm not familiar with the exact cases that you're referring to, one of the things that separates the senior executive service from other entities is the bar for admission is incredibly high. That process to become a senior executive is outlined in very stringent requirements by the Office of Personnel Management. One of the things that I take very seriously is I try and hire the very best. I think I have done that in the time I've been at VA and in my 14 years as a senior executive. I would also suggest that one of my key responsibilities as a senior executive, as a leader in VA, and as a key manager is to ensure that those people, those SESs that work for me, performance is not only acceptable but above acceptable. And it's my responsibility to ensure if I see them veering off course 5 or 10 degrees to bring them back to the straight and narrow. I think I've been very successful in doing that, and I think many, many senior executives at VA also would reflect that.
Thank you, Mr. Coy. We will, we're obviously going to continue the debate on this particular question. We do look forward to your responses to the questions that we propounded to Dr. Petzl, excuse me, Mr. Petzl earlier. Mr. Takano, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Coy, you write that vet success on campus, VSOC, and the pilot program in the Warriors Peer Outreach Pilot Program Act are similar. How are the programs similar when the VSOC personnel have more experience, and the participants in the pilot program will not be equally experienced or trained?
Thank you, Mr. Takano. There are some unique differences from your legislation and the Vet Success on Campus program. One of the things for the Vet Success on Campus program is over the past number of years, we've grown that program from about 8 pilot sites to now 94 sites with 71 different counselors. One of the things that we've established in the last couple years is a mentoring program, and we're doing that on 2 fronts. Actually, we're doing it on 3 fronts. The one front is leveraging work-study students, which are veterans at each of those campuses, to engage fellow veterans and help them in that process. We are also working with VHA's programs in what we call our PAVE program, which is VHA's Peer Advisors for Veteran Education, to provide also a model to enable VRE to do that. We are also establishing a pilot program that we're hiring 16 AmeriCorps volunteers. Those AmeriCorps volunteers right now are 6 veterans, 5 spouses of veterans, 1 civilian, and then 2 pending hires that we think will be veterans as well. So we think between those 3 programs, the AmeriCorps program and our AmeriCorps volunteers that we're hiring, are going to help us be the boots on the ground at those VSOC sites such that they will be engaging with those veterans on campus, and we hope to have those veterans be expanded such that they are recent college graduates, similar to your piece of legislation. I would also suggest that the work-study program students, those are students who have been in school, they've been through the sort of initial piece of their freshman year, early years, and they've seen what you need to do to get through those things. So we have those work-study students as well. And then finally, we also are developing the PAVE program in conjunction with our VHA partners and their behavioral health and psychologists.
Well, along those lines, since VSOC is currently found at the 94 campuses, do you think that the Warriors Peer Outreach Pilot Program Act can be a supplement that could quickly extend to a great number of campuses?
I think it could very well be, and if enacted, we could leverage that program and take pieces of that program and also use it across the other 94 campuses as well.
And similarly, the Warriors Peer Outreach Pilot Program is currently limited to 3 campuses. Would the VA be more inclined to support it if it included more campuses instead of just 3?
Mr. Takano, Congressman Takano, I would suggest that we would take all the help we can certainly get, and we would love to do all the schools we can get. One of the interesting things is, as I look at the number of schools that have, for example, over 1,000 beneficiaries or 1,000 folks going to school using GI Bill. That number is 135 right now today. It could change tomorrow to 136 or 134, but it's right around there. And that accounts for less than 2% of all the GI Bill campuses. So any efforts that we could expand the program, whether it be by 3 or by 50, we would certainly love to do that. My concern would be, however, that resources would come with that. In other words, we take our current VSOC program and we hire, we take an experienced VR counselor and put them on campus full time. And we think that's incredibly valuable. And then we backfill that individual with an entry-level VR counselor. We did the AmeriCorps program at VSOC sites because we thought it was critical that we had that VA person, that experienced counselor, to sort of see that program through.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired.
Okay. Mr. Ranking Member, if it's okay with you, I'd like to go ahead and have a quick second round. Sure. If that's okay. Secretary Kelly, I didn't want you to leave unquestioned, so we'll have a second round. You had a recommendation for H.R. 3614 that DOL should provide only the state's technical assistance, instead requiring that states submit all licensing and credentialing exams to DOL. Can you expand on that recommendation?
Thank you. Yes, I would be happy to. First, I'd like just to share with committee, as because of this is of last week, the Bureau of Labor Statistics annual report on veterans employment. They just come out last week. There is significant improvement with regards to veterans unemployment dropping over this last year from 2012. And actually, in fact, both for the most recent Gulf War era veterans, it's been almost 10% drop. And just to share that improvement is being made, and I want to thank the committee, the administration, and all of us that are implementing the programs and the changes you've made. Some things are working, and they're working in the correct direction.
May I interrupt you for a minute? Do you have that by age cohort?
Yes, I do.
In particular, 18 to 29?
And the 18, what is used, excuse me, Mr. Chairman, what is used in there is the Gulf War II era veterans, which takes it all the way back, I think, from September 12th forward, and I think that takes it all the way up to 35. I do have the data. I'll definitely get it specifically to by the age cohort.
Okay.
But that one has made almost the largest gain in the drop in unemployment, almost to 10%, from 9.9 down to 9%.
Okay.
With regards to your specific question, we do have concerns about this. We do, let me reiterate, appreciate the intention of the bill. And the concerns we are first and foremost opposed to withholding the state funding to hire the DevOps and the leavers. Our result is we see this would penalize the very people that this legislation is aimed at helping, and hopefully help driving down those unemployment numbers. The DevOps and leavers are the individuals at the state level that do provide the critical employment services. There's a second part with concern in this bill, and it is too broad as it is currently written, in that all licenses and credentials issued by a state would be included in that. And I do have numbers on some of the states of the hundreds of licenses and credentials that are offered out there by various state agencies, almost overwhelming sometimes. And finally, many states are already working to streamline the licensing process for veterans and transition services. Every year, legislature meets, more are getting on board to do that. And so it's for those reasons that we have concerns to the bill as it is written.
Okay, thanks, Secretary Kelly. Mr. Coy, one last question for you. In your written testimony on in Section 5 of H.R. 4037, you stated that the VA has the authority that it needs to prioritize voc rehab services. So if you already have this authority, two-part questions. A, how does VA prioritize those? B, what is the filter that they use for the prioritization?
We currently are going through a change in 2 or 3 or 4 things. Prior to this review, we used to prioritize those veterans who were post 9/11 veterans would get, if you will, head-of-the-line privileges. we are now looking across the board with respect to how would we set up a priority system similar to VHA's priority 1, 2, 3, 4, and laying those things out. As you know, most recently, our new Director of Vocational Rehabilitation and Employment, Jack Kammermer, testified in front of this committee, I believe, and one of his responsibilities he's been tasked with by me is to sit down and establish a program to do just that. But we do believe that we have the current authority to be able to do that. The devil is in the details, most certainly. We need to figure out, this balance of fair versus priority, and who gets head of the line privileges, but making sure that nobody gets the back of the line privileges, and so striking that balance is going to be a challenge.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Coy. Mr. Connett, recognize you for 5 minutes for a second round.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Coy, with regard to H.R. 4031, what is the Secretary's general feeling about this attempt to give him enhanced flexibility with regard to the SES?
Thank you, Congressman Takano. That's a great question. I believe the Secretary views on this are pretty clear that he believes that he has the authority to do that. I've met very few individuals in my career, and it's been a long one, that doesn't have any, or that has the moral integrity and the honor that Secretary Shinseki does. He takes SES performance incredibly seriously. I've been in his office where he has ensured that everyone under his responsibility is clear on what the goals and strategic intent of his office and where the VA is headed. I would suggest that Secretary Shinseki's views on this are such that he has the authorities to do those things, and he has in fact done that. He has removed people. He has reduced people's pay. He has reassigned people. He has suspended people. He has done all of those actions specifically in the last 2 years, I know.
So is he, would he view the intent of this legislation for H.R. 4031 as a helpful additional tool, or is he saying that he has enough authority as it is to provide the discipline and order for the SES?
I believe that the view of the Department of Veterans Affairs is that the Secretary currently has the tools available to him or her to ensure that senior executives within the Department of Veterans Affairs are held accountable, and he has in fact used that tool on several occasions.
Is there any thought that providing this flexibility for the Department of Veterans Affairs could also be used as an example for enhanced flexibility in other departments of the federal government?
That's, if you will, an opinion question on my part, and my opinion. This is Kurt Coy's opinion. I would suggest that it could have a detrimental effect on recruiting and attracting candidates to the Department of Veterans Affairs if the Department of Veterans Affairs had a different SES system, if you will, than other departments in the government. The SES system that is in place now has what is generally considered adequate safeguards to ensure that senior executives, if action has been taken, they can go to the MSPB if necessary. That has happened at VA, and in fact, MSPB at one point reversed the decision, then they went back, as I understand it. So there are those tools in place where SESers have due process and so there might be a concern from the perspective of this particular bill that some of that due process may not be available to senior executives.
Do you believe, in your opinion, that removing these protections could, and in fact, turn these SES positions into expanded political appointees?
I don't know that I'm qualified, sir, to make that judgment. I would say, again, my experience as a senior executive, before I came over here, I laid out I looked up the senior executive service and refreshed myself. And this is what the Office of Personnel Management defines. A senior executive service is comprised of men and women charged with leading the continuing transformation of government. These leaders possess well-honed executive skills and share a broad perspective of government and public service commitment, which is grounded in the Constitution. Members of the SES serve in key positions just below the top presidential appointees.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have no more further questions.
Thank you, Ranking Member Takano. I have one parting comment on this particular issue. I was a senior executive in the private sector for 30 years, and I never went to an organization and worried what the due process policies were. I just worried about how well was I going to be able to execute my position and the responsibilities under my authority. And I hope that we can, my encouragement for the VA is to embrace these reforms that we're proposing because they are desperately needed, it sounds like. With this, the first panel is excused with our thanks. We appreciate you joining us, Mr. Coy and Mr. Kelly. And we now invite the second panel to join us. He's leaving. Okay. Before you leave, Mr. Cano, without objection, we're going to change the rules so we can carry on with one member. Okay. Don't object. Okay, good. Okay. All right, with our second panel today, we have Steve Gonzalez, who is the Assistant Director for the National Economic Commission at the American Legion, Mr. Pete Hextus, Chief Executive Officer at Concerned Veterans for America, Mr. Ryan Gallucci, Deputy District Director at the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and Mr. William Hubbard, Vice President of External Affairs at Student Veterans of America. And I apologize to those of you whose names I butchered. I thank all of you for being here, for your service to our nation while you were in uniform, and for your hard work and advocacy for veterans today. Mr. Gonzalez, we will begin with you. You're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Good afternoon, Chairman Flores, Ranking Member Takano, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. On behalf of the National Commander, Dan Dillinger, and the 2.4 million members of the American Legion, we thank you and your colleagues for the work you do in support of our service members and veterans as well as their families. The hard work of this subcommittee in creating significant legislation leaves a positive impact on our military and veterans community. H.R. 2942, enactment of legislation to reestablish the Professional Certification and Licensure Advisory Committee, PCLAC, will benefit service members as well as those who eventually employ veterans in the civilian workforce, easing the placement of qualified veterans in civilian careers, and matching civilian employers with skilled veteran employees. The Department of Veteran Affairs currently lacks subject matter experts that can provide knowledgeable recommendations to improve VA's licensing and certification. Therefore, the American Legion believes that it is extremely important that the PCLAC be reauthorized. The American Legion strongly supports H.R. 2942. H.R. 3056, the American Legion believes strongly in the power of peer-to-peer support and has called for the development of peer-to-peer rehabilitation programs. However, we have several concerns with H.R. 3056. 1, the commissioning of the pilot on only 3 college campuses. 2, the possibility of funding being diverted from existing programs such as Vet Success on campus that already provide such services. And 3, the possibility of redundancy. For more details on these concerns, please refer to our written testimony. The American Legion does not support H.R. 3056 as written. The American H.R. 3614, the American Legion's resolution number 52, holds that we support action that will require the Congress through the Secretary of Labor to ensure that each workforce center in the various states offering labor exchanges services have sufficient funding to provide at least one DVOP and leaver staff to provide services to all veterans requiring employment and training assistance residing within the state. As such, the American Legion cannot support any legislation which would withhold funding to these programs, even as a penalty. The American Legion does not support H.R. 3614 as written. H.R. 4031, the American Legion is deeply concerned with the lack of accountability within the VA. This legislation will provide tools to the Secretary of Veteran Affairs to better manage senior executive service employees and hold them accountable when they fail to perform their duties in a manner that better serves the veterans entrusted to their care. The American Legion supports H.R. 4031. H.R. 4037, the American Legion does not have a resolution or position on H.R. 4037. H.R. 4038, the American Legion believes that in order to ensure the continued success of the delivery of education benefits and accurately track the outcomes of VA's VR&E system, VA will need to maximize the usage of paperless IT systems and be proactive in this area to prevent any kind of backlog as has been seen with disability claims. The American Legion supports the passage of H.R. 4038. H.R. 4147, prior to the passage of the post-9/11 GI Bill, VA delivered education benefits by relying on a combination of manual processes and legacy IT systems. However, the department also determined at the time that its legacy systems were insufficient to support the demands for processing the new benefit. This report will allow policymakers to assess the status of the system, the plan of the system, the plan of action with regard to the finalization of the system, and the anticipated costs. The American Legion supports this bill. H.R. 4150, Congress and other key stakeholders lack essential information needed to assess the performance of many programs in Department of Labor's vets. The American Legion believes a longitude study conducted by a third party will help to identify lapses in program stewardship and will allow for the Department of Labor's vets to make improvements to existing programs and services. The American Legion supports this bill. Lastly, H.R. 4151, since the 2009 implementation of the post-9/11 GI Bill, education benefits have significantly increased for service members, veterans, and their families. However, the VA has yet to conduct an impact study, a survey or study to evaluate the experiences of those individuals using the GI Bill benefit. In order to evaluate how such a robust benefit has impacted the lives of veterans who are transitioning from the military to civilian life, such an assessment on return on investment for policymakers, advocates, and taxpayers is much needed. The Legion supports this bill. The American Legion appreciates the opportunity to comment on the bills being considered by the subcommittee. I will be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Hegseth, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Takano and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. My name is Pete Hegseth, and I'm the CEO of Concerned Veterans for America. We're an organization of veterans and military families dedicated to fighting for the freedom and prosperity here at home that we fought for while in uniform. We're a growing organization of veterans and military families who refuse to accept the status quo in Washington. I'm an Army veteran myself, having served 3 tours since 9/11, Guantanamo Bay, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And today I'm speaking on behalf of the members of Concerned Vets for America and every veteran and their supportive families who feel like second-class citizens in their own system. I'm here for every veteran who's waited and waited and waited for a disability claim. For every veteran who calls a VA hotline and then sits on hold. For every veteran who waits weeks and even months for a medical appointment. Every veteran who receives substandard care. And tragically, I'm here for every veteran who's died because they haven't received the care they needed when they needed it. You've seen the stories, I've seen the stories, and it's long overdue that things change at the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's time for accountability, it's time for transparency, and it's time for results. These stories motivate my testimony here today, as well as my organization's full support of the bipartisan House Resolution 4031, the Department of Veterans Affairs Management Accountability Act 2014. No sober observer of VA's track record, especially in the last few years, can look you, me, or any other veteran in the eye and defend the status quo. The status quo is simply unacceptable, and everyone knows it, especially those who access, or I should say attempt to access, VA's impenetrable, unaccountable, and woefully ineffective bureaucracy. The answer for years has been to spend more money. But as Secretary Shinseki says often, VA has all the resources it needs. Since 2009, the budget for VA has increased by $66 billion. But what VA and its army of advocates will not publicly admit is that VA's problem has nothing to do with money and everything to do with a calcified bureaucracy, calcified culture of mediocrity. At VA, nearly all employee performance is rewarded, regardless of outcome. Poor employee performance is routinely ignored or covered up, and veterans are left holding the bag, wanting and waiting. What we have today is a VA that is very good at protecting managers and staff and not very good at serving veterans. Omar Bradley of World War II fame and of the former Veterans Administrator once said, "We're dealing with veterans, not procedures, with their problems, not ours." Bradley's creed has been turned on its head. VA is obsessed with procedure, and so engulfed in its own cultural problems, they're not serving veterans the way our nation expects. Now, I'm not saying VA leadership, managers, and employees are bad people. They're not. Many of them are veterans, and many of them do an excellent job. But with any bureaucracy, over time, institutional incentives can distort human behavior in ways that become self-serving and process-driven as opposed to customer service-oriented and outcome-driven. This has clearly happened at VA, as not a single senior VA manager has been fired under this administration. Not one. To the contrary, in 2011 and 2012, every SES received a performance rating of fully successful, while the backload and other problems exploded. Tell me this, if basic accountability is not enforced at the top, how can performance be corrected throughout an organization? That's what House Resolution 4031 seeks to combat, providing the VA Secretary with the tools necessary to bend the incentive curve. The bill would simply empower the VA Secretary to fire underperforming managers, specifically members of VA's senior executive service. These are the folks who run the hospitals, lead the regional offices, and run entire departments. The ability to cut through red tape and actually fire bad managers is the same power we give our Secretary of Defense, which Secretary Gates used quite effectively in cleaning up the 2007 mess at Walter Reed. Why should the VA Secretary not have those same basic tools? Now, of course, VA has opposed this reform measure and is peddling their own watered-down version. That's to be expected, as no bureaucracy would demand more accountability of itself. Some in Washington also derided the bill as an issue of employee rights, saying it would undermine existing civil service rules. Critics may frame the issue as a matter of employee rights, but what rights are they defending? The right of a poor-performing VA executive to fail at their job? The right of a VA leadership to retaliate against whistleblowers? Or the right to continue granting extravagant bonuses to failing managers? It takes a very expansive understanding of employee rights to oppose the bill on those grounds. Far from being an attack on dedicated public servants, H.R. 4031 would instead empower and attract better managers. This bill would also bolster the best employees while sending a clear message to poor performers that results matter. We think it would attract reform-minded individuals. In closing, the key question before this committee and this Congress is simple. Who will you stand with? Underperforming bureaucrats who can't be fired, or veterans who are being underserved? The answer to that question is crystal clear. Thank you for this opportunity, and I welcome your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Hegseth, well said, and that's obviously a YouTube that I'd like to play over and over again. So, Mr. Gallucci, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you and the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the VFW. I also want to thank this subcommittee for its hard work over the last year advancing critical legislation like in-state tuition for veterans. We encourage you to keep up the hard work and look forward to working with you to accomplish our shared goals. For the VFW's full thoughts on today's bills, I will refer you to my prepared testimony, as I'll only speak briefly to each of them. First, on H.R. 2942, the VFW supports this bill, and we echo the sentiment of my colleague from the American Legion, who laid out the case for why this advisory committee must be extended. Next, on H.R. 3056, the VFW supports Ranking Member Takano's efforts to better understand the impact of peer support for student veterans. However, we question the need for a pilot program to do this. We worry that a pilot would duplicate what already happens on the ground, thanks to our colleagues from Student Veterans of America, as well as through VA work study and programs like VSOC, VITAL, and Veteran Centers of Excellence. Recently, I discussed peer support with Kenneth Wiseman, the VFW Student Veteran Outreach Coordinator for Virginia and a graduate student at Old Dominion University. Through his work around Virginia, Ken helps schools and student veterans understand the programs and support available to them. Just last week, Ken visited Virginia Western Community College's new Veterans Center, which will soon host 6 VA work-study veterans to offer peer support. At Ken's home campus, Old Dominion, hosts nearly a dozen VA work-study veterans to do the same. The VFW believes that in lieu of a pilot, Congress should instead look to programs like those at Old Dominion to better understand how schools, student veterans, and VA are working together to deliver peer services. The VFW agrees that we know far too little about the student-veteran experience, and we should study peer support models to identify promising practices and potential shortcomings. However, to do so, the VFW recommends studying a diverse selection of schools already implementing peer support programs. The VFW fully supports the goal to report on the efficacy of peer support for student veterans, and we look forward to working with the committee on this issue. Next, H.R. 3614. The VFW supports the concept of this bill to streamline licensing opportunities for veterans. Prior to this hearing, I visited the Army's recruiting website, goarmy.com, which touts the valuable career skills soldiers receive. To the VFW, it seems unreasonable that these skills would not easily translate directly to civilian jobs, as we all know, and we look forward to working with the committee on ways to fix this. On H.R. 4031, the VFW shares Chairman Miller's concerns over accountability for VA management. We support the intent of this bill to give VA broader authority to remove SES employees for poor performance, but have some concerns over the proposal as it's written right now. Any changes must protect that intricate link between political appointees and civil servants, but the VFW agrees that the current system makes it nearly impossible for VA to remove an SES. As a result, the VFW recommends changing the disciplinary procedures to ensure that SES employees must respond to notices within 30 days with some appeal rights intact in lieu of today's open-ended process. Recently, VFW Commander-in-Chief Bill Thine testified that it is a privilege to work for VA, not a right. We look forward to working with Chairman Miller to reinforce this message. H.R. 4037, the VFW supports the intent of your bill, Mr. Chairman, to ensure that VRNE helps the veterans who need it the most. VRNE is nearly at capacity for offering rehabilitative services, and as the military draws down, we share your concerns that without responsible changes, VRNE may be stretched too thin. However, the VFW worries that restricting eligibility will cause some veterans to fall through the cracks. Though we cannot support this bill in its current form, we do look forward to working with you on meaningful reforms that will ensure VRNE can serve those who need it without restricting access. On H.R. 4038 and 4147, the VFW supports both of these bills, and we thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Takano for ensuring the VA invests in its education IT systems and can report on potential shortcomings to make necessary improvements. H.R. 4151, the VFW supports Congressman Bilirakis' efforts to understand the student-veteran experience. Since we do not know enough about today's student veterans, many draw conclusions based on bad information. In my office, my colleagues and I joke that by Department of Education standards, none of us are considered a college graduate. We need quality information to demonstrate veteran success. Coupled with Ranking Member Takano's report on peer services and SVA's recent report on student-veteran outcomes, we believe this bill will allow us to better understand the unique experiences of student veterans, protecting our investment in future veteran leaders. Finally, on the longitudinal study on vets, the VFW believes that Department of Labor vets can provide a critical gateway to civilian employment for many veterans, particularly through the DVOP and ELVR network. Unfortunately, services vary across the country, and we struggle to evaluate what works and what doesn't. Recently, the VFW referred a small business owner in Indiana to his local ELVR, and we're proud to report that the next day he had several interviews lined up with viable candidates. So we believe that this system can work, but we must have proper oversight to ensure that vets can deliver the services veterans need. We support this draft concept, and we look forward to working with the committee to advance it. Mr. Chairman, members of the subcommittee, this concludes my statement. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Gallucci. Mr. Hubbard, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting Student Veterans of America to submit our testimony regarding pending legislation intended to increase support for military service members and veterans. Student Veterans of America is the largest and only national association of military veterans in higher education. Our mission is to provide military veterans with the resources, support, and advocacy needed to succeed in higher education and after graduation. We currently have nearly 1,000 chapters or student veteran organizations at colleges and universities in all 50 states that empowers veterans in their transition and through higher education. This on-the-ground perspective, which comes from every corner of this nation, and our experience in supporting thousands of GI Bill beneficiaries, provides as the framework for our testimony regarding these important issues. The two bills we would like to address today are H.R. 4150 and H.R. 4151 from the offices of Congressman Cook and Bilirakis, respectively. Looking at H.R. 4150, Veterans Employment and Training Services Longitudinal Study Act of 2014, on March 24th, we released our initial findings of our Million Records Project, an SVA-led research study of veterans in higher education in collaboration with the Department of Veterans Affairs and the National Student Clearinghouse. As we look at H.R. 4150, we find it to be complementary to our research and within the spirit of seeking data-driven decisions on programs to support veterans in higher education. Since our organization's inception, we have held that the life cycle of the veterans' transition from the military to school and onward to civilian careers is a highly interdependent process. Each component of this process builds on the preceding steps, and this legislation seeks to empower veterans through several critical stages. For example, the Department of Labor's Veterans Employment and Training Service, VETS, builds bridges for millions of veterans across over the coming years as they pursue gainful careers and post-graduation. However, the current lack of coordination and understanding of the breadth of impact surrounding this part of the transition process is a crucial gap that must be addressed. SVA applauds the interest in moving towards the goal of gaining greater clarity on the impact of job counseling, training, and placement of veterans. In 2012, a GAO report noted that the federal government has sponsored 6 different programs serving at least 880,000 participants at a cost of $1.2 billion. Such a broad variety of resources might be seen as a positive attribute and certainly reflects a sea of goodwill that has developed over the past decade. However, without coordination, duplicative efforts and inefficiencies threaten to stymie this full potential of these resources. A study as this legislation proposes would enable decision makers at multiple levels to understand what is working. As well, the study would highlight areas for change. SVA is in full support of H.R. 4150 and applauds the legislation for being fully inclusive of all individuals of any kind in educational assistance. Turning to H.R. 4151, the Veterans Education Survey Act of 2014, SVA stands in strong favor of Congressman Bilirakis' legislation, H.R. 4151. It is right for some Americans to ask, what are we receiving for our investment in the GI Bill? Indeed, this is a crucial question as more than $34 billion has been spent on millions of veterans who have sought and are seeking degrees in higher education. As previously noted, our Million Records Project has sought to answer that question. H.R. 4151 is an important piece of legislation because it answers another key element of this investment in our veterans: what motivates veterans to pursue the paths that they do. We know that a majority of service members elect to pursue higher education as they transition out of the military. With an expected 1 million new veterans to enter the civilian population over the next several years, the importance of empowering veterans in higher education will continue to increase. Through the Million Records Project, there are several data points that we have gained great insight on, and when paired with the data that would be collected through a study directed by this legislation, the picture will become even clearer. This legislation will add another element to that picture: factors that impact the paths veterans pursue in higher education. The more data available on these topics, the better. Since 2000, over 4 million veterans have benefited from the use of the GI Bill, and American taxpayers can expect that this generation of veterans will positively impact the American economy in magnitudes that will continue for several generations to come. Student Veterans of America is appreciative of the opportunity to provide this testimony. We thank the chairman, the subcommittee members for their time and attention and devotion to the cause of veterans in higher education, and we look forward to continuing to work with the subcommittee, the House Veterans Affairs Committee, and Congress to ensure the success of all generations of veterans through education. Mr. Chairman, thank you for allowing Student Veterans of America the opportunity to participate in this important hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Hubbard. I thank all of you for your testimony. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. This is a question for all of panel 2. When the VA objects to holding senior executive or SES employees accountable, let me rephrase the question. They didn't say that. If the VA is resistant to reforming the SES employment protocols, what sort of a message does that send to our veterans? Let's start with Mr. Gonzalez.
Chairman, at this moment, I am not pretty much the person that would deal with this particular issue. My colleague, who is not here today, we'd be more than happy to follow up with your staff with a written statement for the record on your particular question, Chairman.
Okay. Mr. Hegseth, you were pretty passionate about this subject. What message do you think this sends to our veterans?
I think it sends a signal of detachment from reality, that the bureaucrats or employees or those who, and most, let me be clear, most SES, I use that word bureaucrats, I don't mean it pejoratively. These are folks that want to do well by veterans, but are detached from the outcomes and the realities that are actually coming down the pike and what veterans are experiencing. And when they see failures and they read the headlines and they wait in line, and then they don't see anything change at the top, and then they read about bonuses for executives at failing departments, it tells them the very department that it was meant to serve them is actually serving the interests of other people who can protect those interests easily because they've got access and lobbyists and protections here in Washington. And it's the veteran who's left hanging. So I do think it creates a perception that VA is disinterested and detached from what actually happens in the lives of those veterans and reinforces the separation a lot of veterans feel right now from a department that should be serving them and leaders who should be pounding the table for reform, which is why we believe that the argument the VA has pushed forward that this would discourage good managers is false, is utterly false. Why, as a good manager, would you want to enter a bureaucracy where you cannot affect change, where you cannot reform it so that it's better in the way it provides outcomes? So we'd like to believe that these changes would encourage better employees.
Okay. Mr. Gallucci, what reflections do you have?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to speculate on why VA would come out in opposition to this, but from our perspective, one of the concerns that we have is to keep the pendulum swinging too far in the wrong direction, which is why we look forward to working with the committee to put forward good legislation that'll make sure we can hold senior executive service members accountable for the decisions that they've made. What we wrote about in our prepared remarks discussed that the SES exists to bridge the gap between political appointees and then career civil servants. What we would hate to see is then to hold the SES to the same standard as political appointees, in which you have just another level of political appointee where SESs can just be fired at the whim of whoever's in that administration. We agree that there needs to be a bridge between those two, and that's why we look forward to working with the committee and Chairman Miller to make sure that we have a responsible bill for SES accountability.
Mr. Hubbard, what sort of a message do you think it sends to our veterans and frontline VA employees if we don't reform the SES system?
At this time, Student Veterans of America finds it out of the scope of our mission to comment on this bill.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gallucci, you had a thoughtful suggestion on H.R. 4031, but I do remain concerned that the approach that you've recommended remains too close to the status quo, so we do look forward to working with you in terms of trying to find a way to hold SES employees accountable, but also to, we can't have the status quo. We've got too many things that are not working at the VA the way we'd like it to, bonuses being paid and veterans continuing to suffer, so we will keep working with you on that. Continuing on to another question from Mr. Gallucci, you had some testimony on my VOC rehab bill about the need to prioritize service and ensure the most severely injured veterans receive care first. Can you elaborate on how you would see that working?
This is a discussion we look forward to having. Obviously, the VFW, we would oppose restricting access to the program for veterans who are currently eligible. We worry that some veterans would slip through the cracks. However, we certainly recognize that the program is getting close to a point where it may not be able to deliver the rehabilitative services that veterans need. By the very nature of the program, it's designed to rehabilitate veterans who, because of their service-connected disability, need to find a new career path. And that's why we look forward to working with you on ways to come up with it. One of the issues that I brought up in our written testimony is the ratio of VOC rehab counselors to VOC rehab participants. Right now, the independent budget veteran service organizations report that at about 145 to 1, which is well above VA's acceptable ratio of 125 to 1. So that demonstrates to us that there is some stress on the system. So though we do have concerns about the bill as written in restricting access to some veterans who may need it, who may have a low service-connected disability but a significant barrier to employment, that's why we want to have an open and ongoing conversation about the best way to do that.
Okay. Mr. Hubbard, I've got sort of a two-part question, but I'd like to start with how would you define success for student veterans?
So I would define success for student veterans in terms of them being able to make a clear transition to educational institutions, for them to have a smooth process, which would consist of working with the administration at their universities as well as their peers on campus, and then translating that success over to a gainful employment, to be able to find a career that's both fulfilling and also able to pay the bills. Individuals can't just land jobs. That's not the goal. The goal is to find careers for these veterans that they can actually contribute to society in a positive way, and frankly, really impact the American economy.
Well, I like your definition. Let's based on that definition, I'm going to have a question for you and Mr. Glitchy both. Can you talk a little bit more about the need for hard data to truly show success for student veterans? Can you expand it? We'll start with you, Mr. Edwards.
Sure, absolutely. So a lot of speculation and anecdotal evidence has been provided both ways about how student veterans are faring in both education and then beyond. Without actual hard evidence data, this is just speculation. There's no actual ability to create programmatic change or affect policy. So being able to look at that baseline of data, understanding how student veterans are faring in education, from that point forward, you can actually make data-driven decisions, and you're basing your information on something that you know versus something that you think.
Okay. Mr. Glitchy, can you add to that?
I think it's very important. Like I spoke about in my oral remarks, neither myself nor my colleagues at the VFW are considered college graduates by Department of Education standards, and that really comes from...
They include a bunch of us.
Exactly. I think probably everybody at this table would not be considered a graduate by those standards. And what we saw over the last couple of years is we were creating a false narrative about student veteran performance in higher education. And I have to thank my colleagues from Student Veterans of America for putting out their report that demonstrates that veterans are on par with their civilian peers and actually do better than their non-traditional peers in higher education. What worried me about that report yesterday, though, is that the non-traditional data is more than 20 years old. So we have a responsibility to find quality data on veterans. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is the importance of studying peer-to-peer support in higher education. This is one of the reasons why we encourage the subcommittee, Representative Takano, to adjust fire on their bill on peer-to-peer support. We think peer-to-peer support is critical on college campuses, but one of the problems that we see is that we know this is happening, we know it's happening in droves around the country, but the problem with commissioning a new pilot is that if these sites know that they're being studied, those sites are going to behave differently. Right. We already have this occurring in the community, and if we want to do it responsibly, I believe that we should study what's already happening and then adjust programs within VA and within the veterans community accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Gallucci. Mr. Gonzalez, can you go into more detail about the view that you expressed related to the Department of Labor's current ability to track outcomes and how H.R. 4150 would help to address this problem?
Well, we know in the past that many of the outcomes that Department of Labor lacks has affected, or I should say, the DevOps and leavers and how the resources are being allocated or how the resources are being actually delivered to the veterans transitioning into whatever state that their respective states that they're going back into, whether it's their home state or the current state that they're stationed at. One of the problems we have seen in the past with a lot of the inability for Department of Labor to even know what's going on is how is money, how is the funding going into states, how is the funding affecting where DevOps and leavers are, and in some cases are being not just allocated to help veterans look for employment, but also the whole entire population, which goes against their mandate. Department of Labor, through many past GRO reports, have shown the lack of Department of Labor's VETS program, or Department of Labor in general, ability to actually acquire this type of information. Now, knowing and then being able to acquire such an information, again, will allow for advocates, but also policymakers like yourself, Chairman, and this committee to figure out is the money and being used for the right reasons. And the reason we say that is, as we all know, the drawdowns are coming. The Army alone will be shedding roughly about 140,000 soldiers within the next couple of years, where, guess what? Welcome society, here you go. We know in the past that the Army is spending, and that's the other part to this, is that this particular issue is not just going to affect Department of Labor, but it's also going to affect the Department of Defense. If we can't find those individuals employment, the Department of Defense is on the hook for paying unemployment benefits. And as we well know, in the last I don't know, 10 years or so, the Department of Defense has spent $9 billion in unemployment benefit. Now, that money, which people don't realize, comes out of operating budgets of each respective services, which, again, goes back to our national security, goes back to our readiness, which that is a topic of conversation right now within the public, is how do we continue to have readiness? And if we're drawing down and we can't find them employment, well, DOD better be able to cough up the money because someone is paying for it and DOD's on the hook.
Right.
So it has bigger implications, Chairman.
You do get into a vicious spiral, so, because you hurt readiness more, and then the budgets get tighter, and then more people.
Yes, sir.
You reduce uniform strength. It does get to that spiral that none of us want to see. This is my last question, Mr. Gonzalez, Mr. Gallucci, and Mr. Hubbard. Assuming for a minute that H.R. 4038 becomes law and the VA has upgraded its IT systems related to the GI Bill, what are some of the positive things that you think would happen by doing this? And Mr. Hubbard, we'll start with you first.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. Yes, assuming for a minute that H.R. 4038 is my bill related to having the VA upgrade its IT systems with respect to the GI Bill to go to a rules-based processing system, what are some of the positive outcomes that you think would would be experienced by our student vets?
Well, for starters, I think the ability to have a clear system that they understand and can be responsive, that's the number one outcome. Student veterans who put in for their benefits, who don't get them processed, ultimately, even just 1 month being missed can have a detrimental impact long term. You might miss the first month of classes, university might hold a degree, you might not be able to graduate. And the lasting effects of this can range for years. You know, an individual loses time on their GI Bill benefits, and ultimately it will affect their ability to graduate.
Okay, Mr. Gallucci, same question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I think the reason that we support this or want to see VA finish its IT resources for education is because we've already seen significant progress on automation within processing GI Bill claims. So they've reduced the wait time significantly on initial claims, and then on supplemental claims almost fully automated. So veterans aren't having to wait months to receive their benefits. We've seen some hiccups in the system. We want to prevent those. We think it's a good thing if they finish their IT resources, because then we'll have something concrete in place, something that veterans can rely on, something that they can work off of, and when they, as my colleague Will was saying, that when they show up to school, they know that their check is going to arrive on time, that they can pay the rent and pay the bills.
Okay. Mr. Gonzalez?
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. And again, I will pretty much agree with my colleagues, but also to talk about that will be also is allowing it to streamline such a system to ensure that we don't have the same mistakes we've seen with backlog claims, first of all. Second, the other problem is making sure that by streamlining it, it allows for one less burden for an individual who does have other issues, can be taking care of a family, going to school full-time. I use myself as an example. When I went to school, I was a full-time student, I worked full-time, and I was also in the reserves. So having that's one less burden as myself, as a student veteran, as a drilling reservist, and as well as a full-time employee as a second job. It allows for one less burden for myself to have to worry about, and having such a system would allow myself to, again, pay my bills, pay the school on time, and not be held accountable for basically the issues that VA has occurred. And again, it's to also prevent one other disaster, especially, again, with the drawdown happening. You're going to see more and more student veterans entering actual institutions of higher learning who want to be proactive and not reactive in this situation.
Okay. I want to thank each of you for your testimony today. Again, thank you for your service to our country while you were in uniform. Thank you again for your advocacy on behalf of our nation's veterans, one of our nation's most important resources for our future. If there are no further questions, and I don't think there are, since we have a bunch of empty chairs, I want to thank each of you for being here today and taking the time to share your views on these 9 bills. This is very important to the legislative process, and we appreciate your insight and your feedback and your passion, Mr. Hegseth. We also want to announce that the subcommittee will be holding a markup on some or all of these bills on April the 8th. I ask unanimous consent that the following organizations be allowed to submit testimony for the record: the Association of Private Sector Colleges and Universities, Vets First, Disabled American Veterans, Wounded Warrior Project, and the Senior Executive Association. Without objection, so ordered. Finally, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend remarks and include extraneous material on any bills under consideration this afternoon. Without objection, so ordered. Again, I want to ask you for your forbearance. We started about an hour late in order to accommodate votes, but we appreciate everybody in the audience. We appreciate the VA and the Department of Labor for their forbearance as well, and for our current panel of witnesses. The hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.